Story 1. The Stolen Manuscript of Oxford. You are standing in one of the dim, echoing libraries of Oxford, where the air smells of old parchment and the dust of centuries clings to every shelf. The Bodleian Library, with its vaulted ceilings and its stern guardianship of knowledge, is not the sort of place where one expects a crime to unfold. And yet, for centuries, even these hallowed halls have been vulnerable to theft. This story begins, as many crimes do, not with violence or a dramatic escape, but with quiet calculation. A manuscript disappeared, and in its absence, an entire scholarly community would be deceived. The setting, Oxford's Bodleian Library. Oxford in the late 19th century was both a place of tradition and of growing modernity. The Bodleian Library, already centuries old, was one of the most secure institutions in Britain. Access was limited to a small number of scholars, each vetted with care. Manuscripts were not permitted to leave the library without special permission, and readers were constantly reminded of their responsibility to protect the treasures of the collection. Yet behind the appearance of security there existed cracks. Catalogs were sometimes outdated, records of loans and viewings were incomplete, and perhaps most dangerously, there was a culture of trust that scholars, gentlemen, and clergy who came to consult the texts would never stoop to theft. That trust would be exploited. The manuscript at the heart of this crime was no ordinary book. It was an illuminated text, written by hand in the 15th century, adorned with bright pigments and gold leaf. Its subject was theological, a commentary on the Psalms. It was not particularly famous at the time, not one of the Bodleian's star items, but its rarity and craftsmanship made it valuable enough to tempt someone into taking a risk. The manuscript disappears. The theft itself was not noticed immediately. In fact, this is what makes the story so unsettling. The book did not vanish in a blaze of scandal but slipped quietly from its place, like a coin lost between cushions. Sometime in the 1870s, the manuscript was recorded in the Bodleian catalog, but by the 1880s, scholars consulting that shelf noticed gaps. At first, the missing volume was assumed to be misplaced. Staff began the slow process of checking neighboring shelves, cross-referencing entries, and even contacting readers who had last requested it. But no one admitted to having seen it. It was gone. And yet, unlike other thefts that stir police investigations, this loss remained largely hidden. The Bodleian preferred silence. To admit openly that one of their manuscripts had been stolen would have been to invite scandal. Instead, they quietly marked it in their private records as missing, presumed mislaid. It is here that the second part of the crime begins, not just the theft itself, but the erasure of accountability. A new appearance. Years later, the manuscript reappeared, but not in Oxford. Instead, it surfaced quietly in the hands of a private collector who claimed to have purchased it legitimately. From there, it passed through several hands until it was acquired by a foreign university library. To most eyes, it was just another medieval manuscript, its provenance hazy but not suspicious. For decades, scholars cited this manuscript as if it had always belonged where it now sat. Footnotes referred to its new shelf mark. Articles were written without mention of Oxford. And so, through repetition, a false history took hold. This is where the deception deepened. A crime is not always the single act of theft, it is also the continued distortion of truth. By the early 20th century, few even remembered that Oxford had once claimed the manuscript. The Bodleian, meanwhile, moved on, its shelves still full of treasures, its missing volume quietly forgotten. The scholar's discovery. It was only in the mid-20th century that a careful scholar, tracing references across old catalogs, noticed a discrepancy. The manuscript he consulted abroad seemed to match exactly the description of the one once held in Oxford. Same dimensions, same opening lines, same illuminated capitals. Coincidence was unlikely. The scholar compared notes, digging deeper into provenance records. Where exactly had the foreign university obtained this text? Who had owned it before? The answers were vague. no bill of sale could be found. No clear chain of ownership was documented. It was as if the book had materialized out of nowhere. And this realization carried a disturbing implication: that one of Oxford's manuscripts had been stolen, smuggled into private hands, and then laundered into legitimacy through the passage of time. How could this happen? To you, the listener, this may seem baffling. How could a library as prestigious as Oxford allow such a theft to occur? Why wasn't there an uproar? To understand, one must consider the culture of scholarship at the time. 19th century librarians were underfunded and often overwhelmed. Cataloging was a manual task, requiring painstaking transcription of titles, shelf marks, and physical descriptions. Errors crept in, gaps appeared, and in a world without barcodes, databases, or digital records, a single missing manuscript might vanish without immediate detection. Moreover, there was the Victorian ideal of the gentleman scholar. The assumption was that those allowed access to the Bodleian would never engage in petty theft. To accuse a fellow scholar of stealing a manuscript would have been scandalous, almost unthinkable. This misplaced trust created an environment where the bold or the unscrupulous could act without fear. The motive. What would drive someone to steal a manuscript that, at the time, was not even widely known? Money, of course, is one possibility. Illuminated manuscripts, even obscure ones, commanded respectable prices among collectors. Another motive might have been prestige, the thrill of owning something rare and forbidden, a secret treasure hidden away from prying eyes. There is also the darker possibility that the thief believed the Bodleian itself would not miss the book, that in taking it they were not committing a crime but rescuing an overlooked text. Some 19th century collectors justified their actions in exactly this way, arguing that private care was better than public neglect. It is, of course, a self-serving excuse, but one that complicates the psychology of the theft. A crime without a criminal. What makes this story unusual is that no thief was ever identified. No scholar was caught with ink-stained fingers. The theft was not solved with a police chase or a courtroom confession. Instead, it remained a quiet mystery, whispered among archivists, debated in academic footnotes. And perhaps this is why it feels unsettling. We are used to crime stories where justice is eventually done, where the villain is revealed and punished. Here, the crime lingers unresolved. The manuscript sits today, intact and admired, but its presence in a foreign library is itself a kind of evidence, a clue that points back to Oxford's loss. The lingering question. You are left then with the uncomfortable thought that the manuscript itself is the only witness to the crime. Its pages, beautifully illuminated, have passed silently from hand to hand. The thief is long gone, their name forgotten. The library shelves have been rearranged, the catalogs updated, the scandal buried. And yet, whenever a scholar opens that manuscript, they touch the trace of a theft never solved. Was it a careless staff member, tempted by opportunity? A scholar who believed themselves cleverer than the institution? Or perhaps someone higher up with access and influence who could conceal their tracks? The manuscript does not answer. It remains silent. You imagine the Bodleian Library in the 1890s, its staff moving quietly among shelves that had grown taller and more labyrinthine over the years. Thousands of volumes, many of them manuscripts, were stacked in rows that seemed to swallow light. Catalogs were kept by hand, handwritten notes scribbled in margins by successive librarians. Somewhere among those lists was a line noting the manuscript that had once belonged here, a manuscript now conspicuously absent. The scholar's puzzle. The mid-20th century scholar who rediscovered the problem, let us call him Dr. Howard, though his name is less important than his diligence, began with a curiosity. He noticed that references in 17th and 18th century catalogs listed a certain illuminated Psalter commentary, but modern catalogs in Oxford did not. Yet, across the sea, he found a manuscript with identical characteristics in a North American university collection. It was not unusual by then for European manuscripts to appear in American libraries. The wealthy institutions of Harvard, Yale, and Chicago, among others, had been purchasing European treasures since the Gilded Age. Many private collectors in Europe, needing money or shedding estates, sold to American buyers. But what troubled Dr. Howard was not the presence of the manuscript in America, it was the gap in its story. No sale, no official transfer, no record at all. The Bodleian's response. When Dr. Howard contacted Oxford to inquire, the response was cautious. The Bodleian had indeed once catalogued such a manuscript, but its disappearance had been noted long before his time. The librarians admitted privately that it was presumed stolen in the late 19th century. And yet, they had no wish to pursue the matter further. The Bodleian of the mid-1900s was protective of its reputation. To accuse an American university of possessing stolen property would create diplomatic embarrassment and strain academic relations. And so, they left the matter unresolved. The manuscript, then, remained where it was quietly celebrated in its new home, while Oxford kept its silence. A wider pattern. This was not, unfortunately, a unique case. The 19th and early 20th centuries were marked by a curious pattern of thefts from European libraries. Scholars who had privileged access sometimes took advantage of lax supervision. A single volume might be slipped under a coat or smuggled out in a satchel. Because there were no exit checks, no alarms, and little suspicion, the act could be astonishingly easy. At the British Museum, manuscripts disappeared in the 1840s and 1850s. In Cambridge, rare early printed books vanished in the same period. Sometimes the thieves were low-paid assistants, sometimes they were respected scholars. One famous case involved the theft of medieval charters by a German historian who sold them to collectors. The Oxford manuscript was part of this larger story, a reminder that even the most prestigious libraries were vulnerable. The mechanics of theft. How exactly might the Oxford manuscript have been taken? Picture a scholar of the time. He arrives in the reading room, requests the manuscript through a formal slip, and receives it from a librarian who fetches it from the stacks. He consults it at a long wooden desk, under the watchful eye of others but only occasionally watched. The room is not as secure as one might imagine. A manuscript could be hidden under a cloak or wrapped in papers. Some thieves created false bindings, disguising manuscripts as ordinary notebooks. Others smuggled pages rather than entire volumes, tearing out illuminated initials to sell to collectors of decorative art. The Oxford theft, however, appears to have been a full removal. The entire book disappeared, suggesting a boldness and perhaps the cooperation of someone who knew the library well. The afterlife of stolen text. Once removed from a library, a manuscript had to pass into circulation. Here, the world of private collectors comes into view. 19th century Europe and America were filled with men who prized rare manuscripts. Some were wealthy aristocrats, others newly rich industrialists seeking prestige. Auction houses in London and Paris facilitated sales, often without probing too deeply into provenance. If a manuscript appeared with a vague story from an old European collection, few asked for more. Collectors were content to own beauty, not necessarily history, and thus the Oxford manuscript could be laundered into legitimacy. By the time it was sold to an American institution, it had already passed through enough hands that its origins were obscured. The scholars who knew. Among archivists and rare book curators, the theft was an open secret. Quiet conversations acknowledged that Oxford's missing book was now abroad, but to speak too loudly was to invite conflict. Universities guarded their reputations carefully. Accusing another of harboring stolen property risked lawsuits, diplomatic troubles, and public scandal. So the matter remained one of polite silence. The Bodleian continued its work. The American Library displayed the manuscript proudly. Scholars cited it without question. But beneath that surface, the discomfort lingered. A treasure had been stolen, and no one had been held to account. A scholar's reflection. For you, as the listener, the story may feel strangely anticlimactic. No police investigation, no criminal trial, no culprit in handcuffs. Just a gap in a catalog and a book appearing elsewhere. And yet, this is what makes the story haunting. Crime is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, subtle, and bureaucratic. The Oxford theft represents not just the loss of a manuscript, but the way institutions can bury embarrassment, the way silence becomes complicity. And perhaps it also reflects the psychology of scholarship itself, the desire to own, to possess knowledge, to claim authority. For the thief, the manuscript was more than parchment and ink, it was a symbol of control, of power over history. The unanswered trail. By the 1960s, the debate over the manuscript's origins had mostly faded. The American University listed it as part of its permanent collection. The Bodleian no longer pressed the matter. Scholars moved on. But questions remained. Who had first removed the book? Was it an Oxford scholar exploiting his access? Was it a librarian familiar with the stacks and records? Or was it someone higher in authority, able to cover their tracks with a simple adjustment of a catalog line? The theft was clever not because it required skill, but because it required patience. The thief did not need to sell the manuscript immediately. He could wait, allow years to pass, let memories fade. In time, the book would appear respectable, its theft forgotten. Imagine for a moment the manuscript resting in its current home behind glass, illuminated by careful lighting, catalogued under a new shelf mark that bears no mention of Oxford. Students and visitors pass by, admiring its gilded initials and intricate script. To them, it is simply another medieval treasure in a vast collection. And yet within its pages lies a ghost of history, the silent testimony of a theft that was never acknowledged, never prosecuted, and never repaired. The question of ownership. By the late 20th century, debates about cultural heritage had grown louder. Countries began to demand the return of artifacts looted during colonialism. Greece pressed for the Elgin marbles. Egypt sought its mummies. And libraries, too, faced questions about manuscripts taken or stolen from their shelves. In Oxford, the Bodleian faced scrutiny. How many of its books had been lost over centuries? How many stolen works now rested quietly in foreign collections? And what duty did the library have to pursue them? The answer was complex. On one hand, the Bodleian had rightful claim. The manuscript had been catalogued, shelved, and guarded until it vanished. On the other hand, decades had passed. The book had acquired a new history, a new institutional identity. To demand it back would raise legal questions difficult to untangle. The American position. The American university that housed the manuscript had its own stance. It argued that the manuscript had been purchased in good faith, with no knowledge of its theft. To relinquish it now, they claimed, would set a precedent that could empty their shelves. After all, many American libraries had built their collections on the open European market. If every piece with a dubious provenance were challenged, whole departments might collapse. And so the book remained. But within the academic community, the whispers never died. Scholars knew. And those who cited the manuscript in their work often added, in a cautious footnote, that it had once belonged to Oxford. The crime's impact. What makes this theft extraordinary is not only that the book was stolen, but that its absence reshaped scholarship. For decades, Oxford scholars lacked access to it. Those who could not afford to travel abroad never saw it at all. Research paths were altered, articles written without key references, conclusions drawn from incomplete sources. A theft is never just about money or possession. It changes the flow of knowledge. It shapes what is studied, what is forgotten, what is remembered. The Oxford theft, small as it seemed, had ripple effects across the study of medieval theology. The culture of silence. There is another layer, too, the culture of silence that surrounded the theft. Oxford preferred discretion. The American library preferred plausible deniability. Both institutions, in their own way, allowed the theft to stand unchallenged. This silence reveals something uncomfortable, that institutions sometimes value reputation over justice. To admit failure is to risk scandal. To challenge possession is to risk conflict. And so, silence becomes complicity. The manuscript as evidence. When you think of crime, you may imagine fingerprints, broken locks, or confessions. But here, the only evidence is the manuscript itself. Its parchment pages, written 500 years ago, are also a witness to a crime barely a century old. Every illuminated initial is a reminder. This book was once in Oxford and is no longer. Its very presence in another collection is proof of theft. Yet it remains unreturned, a permanent exhibit of both beauty and betrayal. Lessons learned. From this story, libraries around the world learned caution. By the late 20th century, security measures improved. Catalogs were computerized. Loans were tracked with precision. Manuscripts were monitored under cameras, placed in protective cases, and handled only with gloves. But these measures came too late for Oxford's stolen book, and the lesson was bitter. Even the greatest guardians of knowledge could fail. A reflection for the listener. And so you are left with the paradox. The manuscript survives beautiful, intact, and available for study, but its survival carries a stain, the trace of a theft that was never solved. Perhaps the thief is long dead, buried with secrets unconfessed. Perhaps they once took quiet pride in showing the book to friends, claiming it as a private treasure. Perhaps they even convinced themselves that they had saved it from neglect. But the truth is simpler. It was stolen, and the silence that followed allowed the theft to endure. Story 2. The librarian who faked a century of letters. You find yourself picturing a library again, but not the grand Bodleian this time. Instead, it is a quieter provincial archive, the sort of place where dust motes drift in the sunlight, and the staff are few enough to know one another's daily routines. It is here, in the quiet margins of English scholarship, that a deception would be carried out so patiently, so meticulously, that it fooled historians for nearly a century. This is the story of a librarian who, instead of guarding knowledge, invented it. His crime was not theft in the ordinary sense, but the creation of falsehoods that infiltrated the historical record. The man behind the letters. The librarian's name was John Payne Collier, a Victorian scholar whose interests stretched across Elizabethan drama, antiquarian collections, and the lives of England's poets. Born in 1789, Collier came of age in a world where printed books were plentiful, but original manuscripts were still rare and prized. He rose steadily within the world of letters, contributing to journals, producing editions of Shakespeare, and earning a reputation as a diligent, if sometimes controversial, researcher. But Collier harbored a temptation that proved irresistible, the desire not only to study history but to improve it. Where evidence was thin, he supplied more. Where documents were missing, he discovered them. His forgeries were not crude counterfeits but elegant imitations of 17th century handwriting, ink, and parchment. To the untrained eye, and often to the trained one, they looked authentic. The allure of discovery. You must imagine the Victorian fascination with Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Every scrap of paper, every letter, every forgotten record was treated as a potential revelation about England's greatest playwright and his world. Publishers competed to bring out new editions, each promising fresh insights. In this climate, Collier's discoveries made him a star. He produced letters purporting to be written by actors, playwrights, and patrons of Shakespeare. He annotated volumes with marginalia he claimed were authentic Elizabethan notes. He introduced playscripts that appeared to contain alternate lines of dialogue, new readings, and even lost works. Each new revelation enhanced his reputation and deepened the deception. The first doubts. At first, few dared to question him. Collier was well-connected, polite, and persuasive. But gradually, inconsistencies crept into view. Some of the documents he discovered were too perfect, too convenient in how they supported his arguments. His Shakespeare editions, while rich in detail, seemed suspiciously reliant on sources only he could produce. By the 1850s, whispers spread among scholars. Was Collier simply too lucky? Could it be that his hand, not history, was shaping these discoveries? And then came the scandal. The Perkins Folio. In 1852, Collier announced a discovery that seemed almost miraculous. A copy of Shakespeare's Second Folio, published in 1632, filled with handwritten corrections and notes by a supposed 17th-century reader. These notes altered lines of dialogue, explained obscure words, and offered tantalizing glimpses into how Shakespeare might have been staged. Scholars were enthralled. Here, at last, was direct evidence of how Shakespeare's plays had been read and interpreted in their own time. Collier's reputation soared. The Perkins Folio, as it came to be called, was hailed as one of the most important finds of the century. But doubts lingered. Some of the corrections seemed oddly modern in their phrasing. Others aligned too neatly with Collier's own editorial preferences. And when experts examined the ink under magnification, troubling signs emerged. The so-called 17th-century handwriting appeared suspiciously similar to Collier's own. The exposure. In 1859, a damning report was published by Sir Frederick Madden, keeper of manuscripts at the British Museum, and his colleague Nicholas Hamilton. They accused Collier of forgery, demonstrating through chemical tests that the ink was of modern origin. The marginalia, they argued, were fakes. Collier, confronted, denied wrongdoing. He insisted that he had faithfully reported what he had found, and that if the Perkins Folio was false, then he too had been deceived. But the evidence was overwhelming. The scholar who had once been celebrated as a discoverer was now denounced as a fraud. His career collapsed. His reputation never recovered, and yet the damage he had done was irreversible. A century of confusion. Here lies the true crime, not simply that Collier forged documents, but that his forgeries entered the bloodstream of scholarship. For decades, historians cited his discoveries as genuine. Plays were edited on the basis of his fraudulent marginalia. Biographies of Shakespeare leaned on letters Collier had forged. Even after his exposure, some of his false documents continued to circulate, cited by scholars who had not heard of the scandal or who gave him the benefit of the doubt. The contamination of knowledge spread across generations, difficult to root out entirely. Collier had not stolen manuscripts, he had stolen time, energy, and trust. The psychology of forgery. Why would a scholar of real talent risk everything by forging documents? Some suggest Collier was driven by vanity, the desire to be remembered not just as a commentator, but as a discoverer. Others point to financial motives. Forged documents could increase the value of collections, win lucrative publishing contracts, and secure positions of prestige. But perhaps the deeper motive was impatience. History was too slow in giving up its secrets. Collier, unwilling to wait, decided to supply them himself. In doing so, he crossed the line between scholarship and invention, between truth and crime. If the Perkins Folio was Collier's most infamous deception, it was by no means his only one. The exposure of that manuscript in 1859 opened the floodgates. Suddenly, scholars began re-examining all of Collier's discoveries, and what they found was a tangled web of deceit that spanned decades. A trail of forgeries. Investigators soon realized that Collier's forgeries extended back to the 1830s. Letters, supposed legal documents, playhouse records, marginal notes in printed books, many bore the same suspicious hallmarks. His style of handwriting, disguised but not perfectly. His editorial preferences, too often confirmed by convenient discoveries. The scale of the fraud was staggering. For over 20 years, Collier had been feeding false evidence into the historical record. Some of it was relatively minor, a forged letter by a minor actor here, a marginal note in an obscure book there. But taken together, they painted a distorted picture of Elizabethan theater. The crime was not only in the deception itself, but in the distortion it caused. History, once tampered with, is not easily repaired. Collier's defenses. Faced with mounting accusations, Collier continued to protest his innocence. He insisted he was the victim of misunderstanding, that he had merely reported what he found. If the documents were forged, he suggested, then someone else must have been responsible. But the evidence piled higher. Chemical analysis revealed modern ink. Paper fibers bore signs of tampering. In one case, a supposed 17th century document carried watermarks from the 19th century. Collier's denials grew less convincing. His friends distanced themselves. Publishers withdrew commissions. By the 1860s, he was a disgraced figure, still working quietly but stripped of the credibility he once commanded. The damage to scholarship. The exposure of Collier's forgeries caused shockwaves through the academic world. Editions of Shakespeare had to be revised. Historical studies were retracted. Scholars who had relied on Collier's documents were embarrassed, their work rendered unreliable through no fault of their own. The scandal also cast a long shadow of suspicion over genuine discoveries. Every new manuscript was treated with greater skepticism, every annotation scrutinized for signs of fraud. Collier's crime was not just the falsification of documents, it was the poisoning of trust. Even today, scholars sometimes hesitate when encountering a document linked to Collier. The question always arises, is this genuine or another of his inventions? The collector's dilemma. There was another problem too, the physical manuscripts themselves. Collier's forged documents had entered collections across Britain. Some were in private hands, others in libraries. What should be done with them? Some institutions quietly removed them from their shelves, labeling them as forgeries. Others kept them but marked them clearly as fraudulent, using them as teaching tools in the dangers of forgery. A few, more troublingly, disappeared from view, perhaps destroyed to avoid embarrassment, perhaps locked away to keep them from contaminating scholarship further. The fate of each forged document varied, but together they represented an uncomfortable legacy, artifacts of deception that could never be trusted, yet could not be erased. The psychology of belief. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Collier affair is how easily scholars were fooled. Even intelligent, cautious academics accepted his forgeries for decades. Why? Part of the answer lies in the culture of Victorian scholarship. There was an intense hunger for discoveries, especially those related to Shakespeare. Scholars wanted to believe. Every new find seemed like a gift, a window into the past. Collier supplied exactly what they longed for. There was also the matter of reputation. Collier was, for many years, a respected figure. To accuse him of fraud would have been unthinkable without overwhelming proof. And so doubts were suppressed, questions left unasked, until the evidence became impossible to ignore. The wider consequences. The Collier scandal changed the way libraries, collectors, and scholars approached documents. Greater emphasis was placed on provenance, where a manuscript had come from, how it had been preserved, who had owned it. Forensic methods of analysis improved, with chemical testing of ink and paper becoming standard practice. In this way, Collier inadvertently advanced the field he had corrupted. His forgeries forced scholars to become more rigorous, more skeptical, more scientific in their approach. But this improvement came at a cost. Decades of wasted effort, reputations tarnished, and a permanent scar on the history of Shakespearean studies. The personal cost. For Collier himself, the final decades of life were bitter. He continued to write, producing editions and commentaries, but his work was tainted. Reviewers dismissed him. Colleagues avoided him. His once bright reputation was reduced to a cautionary tale. He lived until 1883, dying at the age of 94, an old man, but one remembered not for his contributions but for his deceit. To the end, he never confessed. Whether he truly believed his excuses or whether he maintained denial out of pride remains uncertain. The image of John Payne Collier that lingers is not of a daring thief or a violent criminal, but of an elderly man surrounded by books, his hands ink-stained, his mind still chasing discoveries. Yet behind that quiet facade was a deception that reshaped the way scholarship would proceed for generations. Collier was not simply a librarian or a scholar. He became, in the eyes of many, the most notorious literary forger of the 19th century. The aftermath of exposure. By the time the scandal reached its height in 1859, Collier was already an established figure, too deeply woven into the fabric of scholarship for his work to be easily excised. His editions of Shakespeare had been widely distributed. His discoveries had been integrated into textbooks, articles, and lectures. To strip them out was painstaking. Scholars had to sift through each claim, each letter, each marginal note, asking, is this genuine? Is this the voice of history or the invention of Collier's pen? This work continued long after Collier's death in 1883. Even into the 20th century, researchers uncovered new forgeries, documents once thought authentic but proven false through careful analysis. It was as if Collier's ghost haunted the archives, leaving traps for each new generation of scholars. A reputation in ruins. For Collier personally, the exposure was devastating. Publishers dropped him, societies excluded him, colleagues avoided him. The man who had once been hailed as a diligent antiquary was now a byword for dishonesty. And yet he did not confess. He maintained to the end of his long life that he had done nothing wrong. This stubborn denial has puzzled historians. Was he truly deluded, unable to admit his guilt even to himself? Or was he simply unwilling to tarnish his name further by acknowledging the truth? In either case, the result was the same. Collier died disgraced, remembered less for his real contributions than for the frauds he perpetrated. The enduring problem. The real crime of Collier's forgeries was not that they fooled people in his own time that is common enough in the history of deception. The deeper problem is that they continued to mislead long after his exposure. Forged documents once seeded into archives are difficult to eliminate. They are copied, cited, and referenced. Even after being identified as fraudulent, they sometimes linger in the footnotes of scholarship, quietly contaminating the record. Collier's handiwork lives on, not because it is believed, but because it was once believed. In this sense, his forgeries achieved a strange kind of immortality. A lesson in skepticism. For libraries and scholars, the Collier scandal was transformative. It taught them that even the most respected figures could not always be trusted, and that reputation was no substitute for evidence. It encouraged the rise of forensic methods in textual studies, the analysis of ink, handwriting, watermarks, and chemical composition. It also fostered a culture of caution. No longer would scholars accept miraculous discoveries without rigorous scrutiny. The burden of proof grew heavier, the questions sharper. In this way, Collier's crime, though damaging, also advanced the discipline he had sought to manipulate. The psychology of forgers. There is something almost tragic about Collier's story. He was not without talent. He wrote extensively, edited with skill, and contributed genuine insights to Shakespearean scholarship. But he could not resist the temptation to go further, to become the discoverer of secrets history had not granted him. This impulse, the desire to improve, history is common among forgers. They are often intelligent, knowledgeable, even passionate about their subjects. What distinguishes them is impatience and the willingness to cross the line between interpretation and invention. Collier, in this sense, was both scholar and criminal, victim and perpetrator of his own ambitions. The broader legacy. What should we make of Collier today? In one sense, he is simply a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of trusting too much in authority. In another sense, he remains an enigma, a man who spent his life in pursuit of literature, only to corrupt it with falsehoods. But there is also a larger reflection here, that crime is not always loud, dramatic, or violent. Sometimes it is quiet, unfolding in libraries and archives, where the theft is not of objects but of truth itself. Collier's forgeries remind us that deception can be as destructive to knowledge as theft is to property. Story 3. The Missing Map of the Arctic Expedition. The 19th century was the age of exploration, an era when distant corners of the Earth were still marked as blank spaces on atlases, when expeditions carried both glory and danger in equal measure. Few regions fascinated Europeans more than the Arctic. Its frozen seas promised a new trade route, the legendary Northwest Passage, but its icy wastes swallowed men and ships alike. It is against this backdrop that one of the quietest, strangest crimes of exploration took place: the disappearance of a map. It was not a shipwreck or a mutiny, not the kind of catastrophe that fills history books, but the subtle vanishing of a single document, a map that was drawn during an Arctic expedition and later lost, stolen, or concealed. And with its disappearance, the record of one of Britain's great ventures into the North was left fractured, full of unanswered questions. The Franklin expedition and the Arctic obsession. By the mid-1800s, Britain had already sent dozens of expeditions into the Arctic. Some returned with charts of coastlines, others with tales of hardship, and a few never returned at all. Among these, the Franklin expedition of 1845 looms largest in popular memory. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, vanished with all hands, leaving behind a mystery that gripped the Victorian imagination. But while Franklin's fate captured headlines, it was far from the only Arctic venture to suffer loss. Other expeditions less famous, but no less perilous, produced their own mysteries. And one such expedition left behind a gap in the record that has puzzled historians for over a century: a missing map that should have documented a vital stretch of Arctic coastline. The mapmaker's craft. Maps in the 19th century were more than navigational tools. They were symbols of national pride, evidence of progress in conquering the world's last frontiers. Every line drawn on Arctic charts was celebrated as a triumph over nature itself. To be a mapmaker on such an expedition was a position of prestige. The lost map was attributed to Lieutenant Robert McClure, an officer involved in one of the many voyages sent to search for Franklin. McClure's journey through the frozen North was harrowing. His ship, HMS Investigator, became trapped in ice for years. He and his crew endured scurvy, frostbite, and starvation before they were finally rescued. Yet amid the hardships, McClure produced detailed charts of coastlines never before surveyed. One of these charts, by all accounts, was particularly significant. It showed a possible navigable channel, a fragment of the Northwest Passage itself. But when McClure returned to Britain, the map was no longer among his papers. The disappearance. How does a map vanish? At first, the absence was chalked up to confusion. After all, the return of Arctic expeditions was chaotic. Papers were scattered, logs incomplete, and men too exhausted to keep careful order. But as years passed, the missing map became harder to explain. Some suspected theft. Maps of the Arctic were valuable, not only to the Admiralty, but also to rival nations eager to claim a piece of the passage. If McClure's map had indeed indicated a viable route, it would have been worth stealing. Others believed the map was deliberately suppressed. McClure was celebrated as a hero, knighted, and rewarded by Parliament for his role in identifying a navigable passage. But what if his map contradicted the official story? What if it showed routes that the Admiralty did not want revealed or errors that would tarnish his reputation? In either case, the map disappeared from the record. The importance of absence. You might wonder, why does the loss of a single map matter? Ships drew dozens, even hundreds of charts during expeditions, but this map carried unusual weight. Without it, the history of McClure's discovery of the Northwest Passage is incomplete. Was his claim accurate? Did he truly chart the route as he said? Or was the triumph exaggerated, propped up by patriotic fervor? The missing document forces us to rely on second-hand reports, official summaries, and McClure's own testimony sources that may be biased. In the absence of the map itself, truth slips into uncertainty. The culture of exploration. To understand this disappearance, you must imagine the culture of 19th century exploration. These voyages were not only about science, they were about empire. Britain's admiralty funded them to secure prestige, territory, and influence. Reports were carefully managed, sometimes rewritten to emphasize success and downplay failure. Maps were political documents. A line on a chart could be used to claim sovereignty over new lands. To reveal too much was to risk foreign competition. To reveal too little was to invite doubt at home. In this context, the missing map becomes more than a personal loss, it becomes a symptom of how exploration was entangled with secrecy, rivalry, and national pride. Theories of the theft. By the 20th century, historians offered several theories. The opportunist's theft, perhaps a sailor or clerk, recognizing the value of McClure's map, quietly removed it and sold it to a private collector. Manuscripts and charts from Arctic expeditions occasionally surfaced at auctions, their provenance hazy. Could the missing map still sit, unrecognized, in a private collection? The Admiralty's silence. Another possibility is that the Admiralty itself suppressed the document. If the map revealed navigational errors or exaggerated McClure's success, it might have been quietly filed away or destroyed to preserve the heroic narrative. The accidental loss. The simplest explanation is that the map was lost in the chaos of McClure's return. Papers were misplaced, damaged by sea water, or discarded as redundant. In this case, the absence is not a crime of intent but of neglect. Each theory has its defenders, and none can be proved conclusively. A crime without a culprit. Like the stolen manuscript at Oxford, this is a crime without a clear criminal. A document vanished, and with it certainty. Was it theft? Was it suppression? Or was it simple chance? What is clear is the consequence. A gap in the historical record that continues to trouble researchers. Without the map, McClure's place in history rests on shaky ground, his claim to have charted the Northwest Passage dependent on words rather than lines on paper. When an artifact disappears, it is tempting to imagine a dramatic theft. A thief slipping into the Admiralty at night, a clerk pocketing a chart to sell to a rival nation. But often, the truth of missing documents lies not in drama, but in the murky world of archives, bureaucracy, and selective silence. The case of Lieutenant Robert McClure's missing Arctic map is one such story, a crime perhaps less of theft than of concealment. The return of the investigator. Robert McClure's voyage was among the most brutal in Arctic history. His ship, HMS Investigator, set out in 1850 to search for Franklin, only to become trapped in ice in 1851. For nearly 3 years, McClure and his men endured freezing conditions, dwindling supplies, and the slow torture of isolation. By 1853, they were on the brink of starvation when they were finally rescued by another British expedition. When McClure returned to Britain in 1854, he was hailed as a hero. Newspapers celebrated his survival. Parliament voted him a monetary reward. He was knighted for having, in the Admiralty's eyes, demonstrated the existence of the Northwest Passage. His charts and reports were expected to cement this triumph. Yet among those papers, one was missing. The detailed chart of a navigable channel, the map that should have proved his claim, was gone. Official reports and gaps. The Admiralty did publish charts based on McClure's voyage, but these were summaries, smoothed and formalized for public consumption. The rough field map, the one supposedly drawn during the voyage itself, was nowhere to be found. Without it, historians must rely on second-hand compilations. Why was the original not preserved? The Admiralty's archives were usually meticulous. Field charts, no matter how rough, were kept. The absence of McClure's map stands out as an anomaly. The Admiralty's dilemma. One possible answer lies in the politics of Arctic exploration. McClure's claim to have discovered the Northwest Passage was controversial even in his own time. Critics argued that he had not actually sailed the passage, but only charted parts of it before his ship was trapped. His crew, after all, had been rescued by traveling overland and ice, not by completing a sea route. If McClure's original map cast doubt on his achievement if it showed errors, gaps, or exaggerated lines, the Admiralty had strong motive to suppress it. Britain wanted heroes, not debates. A triumphant narrative was more valuable than messy accuracy. And so, the theory goes, the map was deliberately removed, ensuring that McClure's place in history would remain untarnished. Private collectors and disappearing charts. Another possibility is more prosaic but equally troubling: theft by opportunism. Arctic maps were highly prized by collectors in the Victorian age. Auction houses in London occasionally sold charts from expeditions, sometimes legitimately, sometimes through shady channels. A clerk or naval officer with access to McClure's papers could have quietly removed the map, sold it to a private collector, and left no trace. There are tantalizing hints to support this. In the early 20th century, a handful of Arctic maps surfaced in private collections, their provenance uncertain. Some were sold abroad, disappearing into the vaults of American libraries. Could McClure's chart be among them, mislabeled and unrecognized? If so, the crime was not just theft, but erasure, the stripping of context that made the map valuable as history. The role of rival nations. The Arctic was not only Britain's obsession. Norway, Denmark, Russia, and later, the United States all sought influence in the region. Information was power, and maps were information distilled. Could McClure's map have been stolen for intelligence purposes? If it showed promising channels, rival powers would have been eager to obtain it. A quiet disappearance from Admiralty files, followed by a discreet handover, is not impossible. In this light, the missing chart becomes part of a larger game of 19th century geopolitics. But here, evidence is thin. No rival nation ever claimed to possess the chart, and if they had, the revelation might have caused diplomatic scandal. The theory remains speculation, yet one that underscores how politically charged maps could be. The scholar's frustration. By the mid-20th century, historians began piecing together the puzzle of McClure's expedition. They found the official Admiralty reports, they traced logbooks, they studied journals written by his officers. But when it came to the critical map, they met only silence. The archives had gaps, and no amount of searching could fill them. For scholars, this is the deepest frustration of missing documents, the sense that history has been robbed of clarity. Without the map, McClure's claim remains ambiguous. Did he truly chart the Northwest Passage, or did patriotic zeal inflate his accomplishment? The absence makes certainty impossible. Patterns of loss. McClure's missing map is not unique. The 19th century is filled with examples of charts, logbooks, and reports that vanished under suspicious circumstances. The Franklin expedition alone produced dozens of documents that were later lost or destroyed. In some cases, these losses were accidents: fire, water damage, or neglect. In others, the disappearances seemed all too convenient, shielding reputations or serving political agendas. The pattern suggests that McClure's missing chart was part of a broader culture of selective preservation. What survived was not always what was most accurate, but what was most useful to those in power. The ethical question. Here, you are left with an ethical dilemma. If the Admiralty did indeed suppress McClure's map, was that a crime in the conventional sense, or was it an act of political expedience? Does concealing a document constitute theft, or merely control of information? The answer depends on perspective. To historians, the loss is a theft of truth. To the Admiralty, it may have been a necessary act to preserve public confidence. To a collector, the disappearance may have been opportunity. In each case, the same absence carries different meanings. When Robert McClure died in 1873, he was remembered as the man who had proven the Northwest Passage. His knighthood, his parliamentary reward, his place in history, all of these remained intact. The missing map was not part of the public conversation. The Admiralty did not mention it. Newspapers did not ask. The silence that had surrounded its disappearance during his lifetime continued long after his death. And yet silence does not erase. It only lingers, waiting for questions to return. The legacy of a lost chart. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Arctic had changed. Norway's Roald Amundsen, not Britain, would eventually be credited with the first full navigation of the Northwest Passage in 1906. Steamships and later icebreakers altered the scale of exploration. The age of wooden sailing ships and hand-drawn charts was gone. But McClure's claim remained in textbooks, upheld by the prestige of the British Empire. Students read that he had been the first to demonstrate the passage. Few were told of the missing map, the gap in evidence that left his claim open to doubt. For scholars, the absence became a nagging problem. The lack of the chart meant that McClure's place in history rested not on what could be seen and verified, but on what was said and believed. In the world of exploration where maps are the ultimate proof, this was a fragile foundation. The consequences of absence. The disappearance of the chart had real consequences. Without it, later expeditions had to rely on less precise Admiralty summaries, which sometimes led to navigational errors. The loss was not just historical, it was practical. Men navigating the Arctic ice might have benefited from McClure's first-hand sketch, however rough. Even more significantly, the absence weakened Britain's ability to defend its Arctic claims. In disputes with rival nations, precise charts were essential. A missing map could mean the difference between solid sovereignty and contested ground. If the Admiralty had indeed suppressed the chart, it had gambled with more than McClure's reputation. It had gambled with Britain's imperial reach. A ghost in the records. Occasionally, rumors surfaced. In the early 20th century, whispers circulated that McClure's chart had been seen in a private collection. A few Arctic enthusiasts claimed to have glimpsed a mysterious map in auction catalogs, though none could verify its authenticity. No surviving record proves these claims. The possibility remains tantalizing that somewhere in a drawer or archive mislabeled and overlooked, McClure's missing chart still exists. A sheet of paper, yellowed by time, its lines shaky from cold hands, waiting to resurface. If ever found, it could settle debates that have lingered for more than a century. The broader pattern. The disappearance of McClure's chart fits a broader theme in the history of exploration. That absence is as telling as presence. What is missing often reveals as much as what survives. In McClure's case, the missing chart suggests a story less about one man and more about the institutions around him, institutions that valued narrative over accuracy, prestige over transparency. In this light, the missing map is not just an accident or a theft, but a symbol of how exploration was shaped by silence, by what was allowed to be remembered and what was allowed to vanish. Reflection, what we cannot know. As you listen now, you may find the story unsatisfying. There is no culprit, no recovered artifact, no dramatic revelation. Only a map that should exist but does not. But perhaps this is the essence of certain crimes, not resolution, but absence. The crime lies in the uncertainty left behind, in the questions that will never be fully answered. What did McClure's map show? Did it confirm the Northwest Passage as he claimed, or did it expose gaps in his survey? Was it stolen by opportunists, suppressed by officials, or lost by chance? Each possibility leads to a different story, but none can be proved. Story 4. The art forger who preferred sleepy town auctions. When most people imagine art forgery, they think of glittering galleries in Paris or New York, of high-stakes sales at Sotheby, of dramatic revelations when a painting worth millions is unmasked as a fake. But some of the cleverest forgers chose not the spotlight, but the shadows. This is the story of one such man, a quiet painter who preferred not the auction houses of London, but the provincial sales of sleepy English towns. His crime was not violence, nor even open theft, but something more subtle and imitation so convincing that it blended into the background of ordinary life. For decades, his forged paintings slipped unnoticed into circulation, admired by unsuspecting buyers, hung on walls, and cited in catalogs. It was only later, when suspicions arose, that his long game of deception came into view. The world of provincial auctions. To understand his strategy, you must picture the world of provincial art auctions in mid-20th century Britain. In small towns across the country, dusty auction rooms handled the estates of the recently deceased, the downsizing of families, the liquidation of collections. The sales were modest furniture, porcelain, books, and, occasionally, paintings. Unlike the great houses of Christie's or Sotheby's, these provincial auctions had little in the way of expertise. Catalogs were brief, descriptions vague. A painting might be listed as in the style of Constable or School of Turner, without further comment. Buyers were local dealers, curious amateurs, and the occasional collector hopping to strike gold. It was here, in this overlooked corner of the art world, that the forger saw his opportunity. The man himself. His name was not splashed across newspapers during his lifetime. He was no Michelangelo in disguise, no flamboyant conman. Instead, he was quiet, solitary, almost anonymous, a minor painter with skill but no fame, working in obscurity. What set him apart was not his ambition to be recognized as a great artist, but his ability to disappear into other men's styles. He studied the brushwork of English landscape painters John Constable, J.M.W. Turner, Richard Parkes Bonington, absorbing their techniques until he could reproduce them with uncanny accuracy. His works were not masterpieces, but modest oils and watercolors that seemed perfectly plausible as forgotten sketches or student works of these famous men. And then he began to insert them into the stream of provincial auctions. The perfect crime scene. The brilliance of his scheme lay in its modesty. High-value forgeries attract scrutiny. A painting claimed to be a lost Turner offered at Sotheby's would invite teams of experts, chemical tests, and microscopic analysis. But a small canvas of a misty river scene, labeled simply, attributed to Turner in a provincial auction catalog, that could slip by unnoticed. Buyers in these sales were often more hopeful than skeptical. A local dealer might buy a possible Constable for a few pounds, dreaming of reselling it in London for more. Even if doubts arose, the sums involved were small enough to discourage costly investigations. The forger knew this. He placed his works carefully, never overreaching, never too bold. They were small, believable, unassuming. In this way, he created a steady trickle of forgeries that entered the market and blended with genuine works. The materials of deception. Forgers live and die by materials. The wrong pigment, the wrong canvas, the wrong varnish, any of these can betray them. Our quiet forger was meticulous. He scavenged old canvases from flea markets, stripping them of their original paintings. He collected antique frames. He ground pigments in the traditional way, mixing them to imitate the muted tones of early 19th century oils. In some cases, he even sourced period paper for his watercolors, cutting it from blank end papers of old books. Every detail was chosen to pass casual inspection. And because provincial auctions did not conduct chemical testing, his precautions were more than sufficient. The first successes. At first, his forgeries were sold for modest sums: £5 here, £10 there. Hardly the spoils of grand crime. But the thrill was not in the money. It was in the deception itself. To watch his painting listed in a catalog as possibly by Constable, to see a dealer carry it away believing he had made a discovery, this was the forger's true reward. Over time, however, the sums grew. A supposed Turner sketch might fetch £50, then 100. Dealers resold them in London for several times that. Each sale reinforced the illusion that genuine minor works by great painters continued to surface in country houses and attics. The forger's hand became invisible, hidden behind the reputations of others. The slow spread. As the years passed, his forgeries spread quietly through collections. Some were sold to private buyers, hung on dining room walls, and admired for decades. Others found their way into dealers' inventories, circulating through the secondary market. A few, inevitably, climbed higher, reaching the catalogs of more prestigious auction houses, where they were still accepted as authentic. And so, by degrees, the forger had achieved what few criminals ever do. Not just a single success, but a system. A steady, sustained deception that endured for years, unnoticed and unchallenged. The first whispers of doubt. Eventually, however, whispers began. A dealer in London noticed that several supposed lost sketches by Turner, all purchased from different provincial auctions, bore uncanny similarities. The brushwork was consistent, but too consistent, too neat, too careful. A scholar comparing two of these works pointed out that the same pigment, rarely used by Turner, appeared in both. Slowly, suspicions grew. Could it be that these were not forgotten works of great painters, but deliberate imitations? But suspicion alone was not proof. And in the world of art, where authenticity is often a matter of opinion, doubt does not always destroy belief. Many of the forger's works remained accepted, even celebrated. The art market, like the world of rare books or Arctic charts, thrives on trust. Provenance, catalogs, the opinions of experts, all are meant to anchor objects in certainty. But trust can be fragile. Once cracks appear, they spread quickly. And so it was with the quiet forgeries seeded into England's provincial auction houses. By the late 1960s, dealers and scholars began to notice patterns that did not sit comfortably. A string of rediscovered paintings, all emerging from small sales, bore curious similarities. At first, doubts were whispered only in private. To accuse a painting of being a forgery was to risk lawsuits, reputational damage, and financial loss. But gradually, suspicion hardened into investigation. The dealer's unease. Dealers in London often relied on provincial auctions for fresh stock. It was common to buy an attributed painting cheaply in a small town and resell it in the city at a healthy profit. But when several of these supposed finds began showing up as minor Turners or sketches by Constable, questions arose. Could it be coincidence that so many forgotten works had suddenly surfaced? A few dealers quietly compared notes. They noticed consistencies in brushstroke and palette that seemed odd. The skis in these landscapes had the same soft blending of whites and blues, the same slightly hesitant hand. The riverbanks curved in a familiar way. They began to suspect that these paintings were not the scattered remnants of great men's careers, but the product of a single, modern brush. The scholars enter. Scholars of art history, too, grew suspicious. At universities, graduate students began cataloging provincial sales records, trying to trace works attributed to Constable and Turner. They found clusters of paintings appearing from nowhere, with no traceable history before the 1940s or 1950s. When chemical analysis was applied to one such work, it revealed pigments not in use until the 20th century. A supposed Turner sketch contained titanium white, a pigment unknown in his lifetime. The finding did not immediately expose the forger after all. It could have been a later restoration, but it deepened the doubts. The forger's silence. Meanwhile, the man himself remained invisible. He lived quietly, selling his works through intermediaries. He rarely attended the auctions where his paintings appeared. Instead, he relied on a network of dealers who would place them, allowing him to keep his distance. His neighbors saw him as an ordinary man, solitary, somewhat eccentric, but not remarkable. Few suspected that he was feeding the art market with a steady stream of imitations. This invisibility was his greatest strength. By avoiding the limelight, he avoided scrutiny. While other forgers sought fame, sometimes even boasting of their deceptions, he preferred obscurity. The turning point. The turning point came when a cluster of his works reached a larger auction house. A supposed Bonington watercolor, alongside two small Turner oils, were consigned to Christie. The experts there, accustomed to high scrutiny, examined them closely. Something felt wrong. The Turner oils seemed too neat, lacking the spontaneity of the master's hand. The Bonington watercolor, though pretty, contained stylistic quirks not consistent with his known works. Christie's quietly withdrew the pieces from sale, citing doubts about authenticity. The withdrawal sparked gossip. Collectors began questioning other works purchased in provincial sales. Dealers found themselves facing uncomfortable inquiries from clients. The house of cards had begun to tremble. The investigators close in. As suspicions mounted, art crime investigators became involved. Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques Unit, established in response to a rise in cultural thefts, took an interest. They combed auction records, interviewing dealers and tracing the path of questionable works. What emerged was a troubling pattern. Dozens of paintings, all with vague provenance, all attributed to a handful of famous names, all funneled through small-town auctions in the same regions of England. The trail led back slowly to the quiet man in his studio. Though he had taken care to remain hidden, patterns of consignments, handwriting on auction slips, and payments to intermediaries pointed in his direction. The market reacts. The revelation that provincial sales had been seeded with forgeries caused turmoil. Collectors who had purchased works attributed to Turner or Circle of Constable began demanding refunds. Dealers scrambled to defend themselves, claiming ignorance. Auction houses tightened their procedures, introducing more rigorous cataloging standards. But the damage was done. Trust had been shaken, not just in provincial sales but in the art market more broadly. How many other quiet forgers were out there, working unnoticed? How many canvases hanging in English homes were, in fact, the products of deception? The forger's motives. When eventually confronted, the man admitted little. He claimed he had never sold a painting as a genuine Turner or Constable, only as works in their style. If dealers chose to exaggerate, that was their fault, not his. But this was disingenuous. His technique, his careful choice of materials, his deliberate use of old canvases, these were not the actions of a man producing harmless imitations. They were the hallmarks of forgery. His goal was not to pass his works as his own, but to erase himself, to become invisible behind the names of others. Why? Perhaps it was money. Perhaps it was spite against an art world that had ignored his own work. Or perhaps it was simply the thrill of deception, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his brush had fooled experts. By the time suspicions hardened into certainty, the man at the center of the provincial auction forgeries was already old. His career as a forger had spanned decades, his paintings scattered across Britain in private collections, small museums and dealers' inventories. To many, he was a ghost never famous, rarely seen, barely remembered. And perhaps that was his design all along. The knock on the door. When investigators finally traced the pattern back to him, They found not a glamorous criminal mastermind, but a modest man in a modest home. His studio was cluttered with canvases, paints, and half-finished landscapes. On one wall, a river scene in the style of Constable. On another, a stormy seascape echoing Turner. Each was convincing enough to fool a casual eye. Police seized works in progress, pigments, and notebooks containing sketches and practice signatures. The evidence was damning. Though he insisted he had never directly sold a painting as genuine, the meticulous mimicry, the aged materials, and the auction records told another story. He was unmistakably the source of the forgeries. The legal outcome. The case against him, however, was complicated. Unlike jewel thieves or bank robbers, art forgers often occupy a gray area in law. To convict, prosecutors had to prove intent to defraud, that he had knowingly passed his works as those of other artists for profit. His defense was simple. He claimed he painted in the style of famous artists, that he never labeled them otherwise, and that dealers and buyers bore responsibility for exaggerating their authenticity. In the end, the case fizzled into a quiet resolution. Some works were confiscated, others quietly resold with disclaimers. The forger himself avoided prison, living out his final years in obscurity. His name barely entered the newspapers and soon faded from public memory. But his forgeries remained, scattered like seeds across collections. The market in doubt. For dealers and collectors, the exposure was unsettling. Paintings once proudly displayed as Turner sketches or Constable studies were now suspect. Some were downgraded in catalogs to School of or Circle of, their value plummeting. Others remained unexamined, their owners unwilling to face the possibility of deception. The scandal shook faith in provincial auctions. Buyers grew wary, auction houses became stricter, and the romantic dream of discovering a lost masterpiece in a dusty country sale grew more remote. The forger had changed the market not through brilliance, but through persistence. The psychological portrait. Who was he really? A failed painter, embittered by lack of recognition. A craftsman who found more satisfaction in imitation than originality. Or simply a trickster, amused by his ability to fool the experts. Perhaps it was all three. Unlike flamboyant forgers who boasted of their exploits, he remained quiet to the end, offering no confessions, no memoirs, no dramatic explanations. His motives remain as enigmatic as his works. What is clear is that his crime was not motivated by greed alone. The sums involved, though comfortable, were never vast. Rather, it was the deception itself, the quiet thrill of watching others misattribute his works, that seems to have driven him. The afterlife of forgery. Today, art historians still encounter his paintings. Some are easily dismissed, too tidy, too consistent, too modern in pigment. Others remain disputed, hovering in the limbo of attribution. And here lies the strange afterlife of forgery. Once a forgery enters the record, it never truly disappears. It haunts catalogs, footnotes, and collections. Even exposed, it lingers. Dealers debate whether to destroy or preserve such works. Some are kept as curiosities, examples of deception. Others vanish quietly, withdrawn from public view. In this sense, the forger achieved a kind of immortality. Though his name is forgotten, his works remain, ghosting through the art world, never entirely erased. Reflection: the nature of quiet crime. Unlike spectacular heists or violent frauds, this crime unfolded in silence. No alarms were triggered. No masterpieces were snatched from galleries. Instead, a man painted quietly in his studio, seeding the world with small lies that grew into a web of deception. His forgeries remind us that crime need not be dramatic to be profound. A brushstroke, a canvas, a label in an auction catalog, these were his tools. And with them, he reshaped the market, unsettled trust, and blurred the line between authenticity and imitation. Story 5. The unsolved theft of the village church bell. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes. the slow, resonant toll of a church bell drifting across an English village in the evening air. For centuries, these bells marked the rhythm of life, calling parishioners to service, signaling weddings and funerals, even warning of fire or invasion. They were not only instruments but symbols of community, binding together villages through sound. But what happens when the sound goes silent? This is the story of a crime as strange as it is quiet. The theft of a church bell from a small English parish, a crime that left an entire community bewildered. No violent break-in, no trace of the culprits, just an empty belfry and silence where a voice of bronze had once rung. The village setting. The setting was a modest village in the English countryside in the late 19th century, a place of fields and hedgerows, of cottages with thatched roofs and cobbled lanes. Its church, though not grand, was ancient, built in the medieval period. Its bell had hung for centuries, weathered by time but still strong, its notes carrying across the meadows. The bell was not merely an object. It was memory, tradition, identity. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, all had been marked by its voice. Generations grew up beneath its tolling. To steal it was not simply to remove a piece of metal, it was to silence a part of the village's soul. The crime discovered. It was a weekday morning when the theft was discovered. The sexton, climbing to the belfry to inspect the ropes, found the space empty. The bell, massive, weighing nearly half a ton, was gone. The villagers at first thought it impossible. A bell could not simply vanish. It was too heavy, too cumbersome, bolted to its frame. Removing it would have required tools, planning, and more than one pair of hands. Yet the evidence was plain. The timbers were bare, the ropes cut, the fittings removed. Someone had taken the bell in the dead of night. Word spread quickly. By afternoon, the entire village was gathered in disbelief around the churchyard, staring up at the silent tower. How could it be done? The practical question loomed large. How had the thieves accomplished it? A church bell of that size required labor to hoist or lower. Did they dismantle it piece by piece? Did they use ropes and pulleys, lowering it into a cart under cover of darkness? Some villagers swore they had heard nothing in the night. Others recalled faint sounds, creaking wood, distant clanking, but thought little of it. If the thieves had been clever, they might have muffled the operation, timing it for hours when the wind masked their noise. The audacity of the act unsettled the community. This was no petty theft. It was a crime requiring planning, muscle, and daring. Theories begin. Almost immediately, theories abounded. Some suspected local blacksmiths, reasoning that the bell's bronze could be melted down and sold as scrap. Others whispered about rival villages. Was the theft a prank, a bold act of spite? Still others imagined traveling tinkers or gypsies, scapegoated as outsiders often were in rural England. The vicar, in his Sunday sermon, warned against suspicion without evidence. But suspicion was difficult to restrain in a community suddenly deprived of its most cherished possession. The value of a bell. Why would someone steal a church bell? Beyond its symbolic weight, it carried practical value. Bells were made of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, both valuable metals. A stolen bell could be melted down and sold, its origins untraceable. Yet there was also the possibility that the bell itself, not its metal, was the prize. Antique bells were prized by collectors and sometimes purchased by wealthier churches. Could it have been stolen to order, spirited away to hang in another belfry? The possibilities only deepened the mystery. The investigation. Local authorities launched an inquiry. Constables interviewed villagers, searched nearby fields, and questioned blacksmiths. They looked for carts with suspicious loads, for signs of heavy wheels on muddy lanes. But evidence was scarce. Whoever had taken the bell had done so efficiently, leaving no obvious trail. Without fingerprints or forensic tools, the 19th century police had little to go on. The investigation soon stalled. The village in silence. The absence of the bell was felt keenly. Sundays passed without its toll. Weddings seemed oddly muted without its peal. Funerals lacked the solemnity the bell once provided. The silence was not only physical but emotional, a constant reminder of the crime. The villagers grumbled in taverns, speculated in cottages, and searched barns and sheds in vain. Some swore the bell would never be found, that it had been carted off to distant smelters. Others clung to hope that it might one day be returned. The days following the discovery of the missing bell were filled with talk, the sort of talk that thrives in a small community when something inexplicable happens. Each villager had a theory, and each theory seemed more outlandish than the last. Without evidence, rumor became its own kind of truth, spreading from cottage to cottage, field to field, until the village was saturated with suspicion. Suspicions turn inward. At first, the whispers focused on outsiders. It was easy to blame the traveling groups who sometimes passed through, pitching tents in the meadows or camping along the road. They were strangers, after all, rootless, unfamiliar, always moving on. In the imagination of the village, who else would dare something so brazen? But as the days stretched into weeks with no sight of the bell, the suspicion began to turn inward. Someone local must have been involved, the villagers reasoned. Only those familiar with the church, with its routines and its vulnerabilities, could have planned such a theft. Outsiders could not have known that the sexton checked the ropes only once a week, or that the vicar lived far enough from the churchyard not to hear faint noises in the night. The possibility that one of their own might have played a role unsettled the community more than the crime itself. A blacksmith's burden. Attention soon fell on the village blacksmith. He had both the tools and the knowledge to break apart a bell and melt its metal. More troubling, he had recently struggled with debt. His accounts, it was said, were behind with several suppliers. The constables questioned him repeatedly. He denied everything. His forge, they noted, was far too small to melt such a massive object, and though his debts were real, he swore he would never dishonor himself by stealing from the church. Still, suspicion lingered. Some villagers stopped bringing work to his forge. Others crossed the street when they saw him. In small communities, suspicion can be as destructive as guilt. Tracks that led nowhere. Investigators did find faint traces in a nearby lane, deep ruts in the earth, as though from a heavily laden cart. The ruts led north out of the village, then faded where the ground hardened. Some argued the cart had turned toward the market town. Others insisted it had gone into the woods. But no cart was ever found, and no witness recalled seeing such a load pass through. The trail evaporated, like so many others in the case. A rival village. Theories turned darker still. Some whispered of rivalry. A neighboring parish, larger and wealthier, had recently lost its own bell to a crack, silencing its tower. Was it possible that someone there had arranged to steal the village bell as a replacement? The idea spread quickly, for it contained both drama and a hint of vengeance. Villages often competed in subtle ways: whose harvest was better, whose choir sang louder, whose bell rang truer. To imagine a rival parish hearing men to steal the bell was almost satisfying, a story that gave meaning to the loss. Yet there was no proof. No church in the county suddenly boasted a new bell. No craftsman admitted to recasting an old one. The theory, while tantalizing, remained speculative. The silence of the authorities. As weeks turned into months, the constables quietly abandoned the investigation. The trail was cold, the evidence non-existent, the resources limited. Rural police in the 19th century had little power and even less money to pursue such mysteries. The vicar pressed for continued inquiries, but his appeals fell on deaf ears. In the end, the theft of a bell, however shocking to a village, was a low priority in the grand scheme of county crime. For the villagers, this silence felt like betrayal. They had lost their voice, their heritage, their symbol, and the law offered no answers. Folklore begins. In the absence of justice, folklore took root. Stories sprang up around the bell's disappearance, told by candlelight in cottages, murmured in taverns after dark. Some said the bell had been lowered into the river at night, hidden beneath the waters until it could be hauled away. Children were told that if they stood by the river on a quiet evening, they might hear the faint toll of the drowned bell. Others swore it had been buried in a field, hidden under soil and grass, waiting for discovery. Old farmers claimed their plows had struck iron in the earth, though no one ever unearthed such a treasure. The myths grew larger as time passed. The bell was said to toll by itself on stormy nights, echoing faintly across the village though the belfry was empty. Ghost stories mingled with the crime, transforming it from theft into legend. The community fractures. But behind the folklore lay bitterness. The absence of the bell was not simply inconvenient, it was divisive. Weddings without the bell felt less joyous, funerals less solemn. Villagers argued over who bore responsibility. Was it the sexton for not securing the tower? Was it the vicar for failing to protect the church's property? Or was it the blacksmith whose innocence many still doubted? Accusations divided neighbors, friendships strained, and an unease settled over the community. The silence in the tower became symbolic of something greater. Trust, once lost, is not easily restored. The bell never returned. No cart was intercepted, no fragment of bronze uncovered, no whispered confession emerged from the lips of an aging thief. In the records of the parish, the entry was stark. Bell stolen, not recovered. That single line summed up years of frustration, grief, and unanswered questions. Yet the absence of the bell would shape the village in ways no one could have foreseen. The theft became more than a crime. It became a defining feature of the community's history, echoing through memory long after the belfry fell silent. The replacement. In time, the villagers pooled their resources to commission a replacement bell. It was smaller, plainer, and lacked the deep resonance of the original. Its toll was functional but not inspiring. To older parishioners, it sounded hollow, lacking the weight of centuries. But to younger villagers' children who had never known the original bell, the new one was simply the bell. For them, the story of the stolen bell belonged to the past, a legend told by grandparents. Life moved forward, even if the sound was never quite the same. The lingering mystery. Despite the replacement, the question of the stolen bell lingered like an itch that could not be scratched. Theories multiplied with the passing decades. The scrap theory, that it had been melted down in some hidden forge, its metals dispersed into tools, candlesticks, or weapons. If true, then the bell's voice had been scattered, dissolved into everyday objects. The rival parish theory, that a wealthier church had quietly bought the bell, its origin disguised. In this telling, somewhere in England another congregation was unknowingly ringing the stolen voice of the village. The secret burial theory, that the thieves, unable to transport such a heavy prize, had hidden it in a nearby field or river, intending to return but never doing so. Each theory offered comfort to some, suspicion to others, but none delivered certainty. Echoes in folklore. The theft, unsolved, slowly shifted into folklore. Children dared one another to climb the empty tower at night, listening for phantom tolls. Some swore that on stormy evenings, the lost bell rang faintly in the distance, carried on the wind from some hidden resting place. The story became a parable in sermons, a reminder of the fleeting nature of earthly possessions, or a lesson in vigilance against sin. Teachers used it as a cautionary tale, telling pupils that dishonor could silence a whole community. The bell was gone, but its absence became presence. It lived on in imagination, in story, in caution and mystery. Investigative reflections. From the perspective of crime investigation, the theft of the bell is instructive. It illustrates how crimes that seem impossible can, in fact, be carried out with planning and daring. Removing a half-ton object from a tower without detection requires knowledge of ropes, pulleys, and timing. It demonstrates that even in rural settings where everyone knows everyone, outsiders can slip in, commit a bold crime, and vanish without leaving a trace. It also highlights the limits of 19th century policing. With no forensic science, no widespread communication, and few resources, rural constables were ill-equipped to pursue complex thefts. What today might involve fingerprints, tire tracks, or surveillance was then simply guesswork. Perhaps the thieves knew this. Perhaps they counted on the limitations of the system to ensure their success. Community consequences. The theft also changed the fabric of the village itself. For years afterward, a subtle mistrust remained. When you are forced to suspect your neighbor, your blacksmith, your rival parish, something in the social fabric tears. Even when repaired, the stitching is visible. Some families left the parish, unsettled by the silence. Others clung more tightly to tradition, determined not to let crime define them. The replacement bell was rung more faithfully than ever, not because it inspired awe, but because it asserted resilience. We are still here. Broader legacy. Interestingly, the theft of church bells was not unique. Across Europe, bells were sometimes stolen for their metal, especially during times of war when bronze was in high demand for cannons. But to see such a theft in a quiet rural parish, in peacetime without clear motive, made it remarkable. Historians who examine parish records note that these small crimes often leave deep marks on local culture. A stolen sheep might be forgotten. A stolen bell becomes legend. The difference lies not in material value but in symbolism. The Oxford scholars who debated manuscripts, the detectives who pursued jewel thieves, all grappled with crimes of intellect and wealth. But in the countryside, a stolen bell could matter just as much. Story 6. The Gentleman Forger of Paris. You're seated in a reading room off the Seine, the kind of Parisian space where the light is thin and the voices lower themselves to a murmur out of instinct. Cabinets of paper, a scent of dust and iron gall ink, sweet and sharp. The man across from you does not look like a criminal. His cuffs are neat. His penmanship is better. He has a talent for listening, for repeating things back in a way that flatters the speaker. He says there are letters, oh yes, letters, and if you wait a week he will have more. He knows the dealers, the retired notaries, the cousins of provincial magistrates who saved everything. You do not know his name yet, but Paris will learn it. Denis Vrain-Lucas, the most industrious literary forger of the 19th century. Wikipedia. He begins small. He tells collectors what they long to hear, that the past is closer than they think, that the right drawer will unstick for the right hands. He offers a few modest pieces, a philosopher's note, a poet's reminder to a printer, the everyday litter of great men. But desire is a patient tutor. The more he sells, the better he sees what moves the learned heart. Not just scraps, proofs. Proofs that tilt the plumb line of history a few crucial degrees. One name matters most. Mitchell Chasles, mathematician, academician, patriot. He is the kind of collector who believes that France, if properly searched, will yield documents that prove French minds saw first, saw further. When Vrain-Lucas approaches him around 1861, with letters by Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and Blaise Pascal, letters that seem to make a Frenchman the spark for an Englishman's fire, Chasles listens. If Pascal hinted at gravity before Newton, then a national story reshapes itself. If French priority can be traced in ink, a nation stands straighter. Chasles buys and he keeps buying. Wikipedia. You picture how these exchanges unfolded. A narrow office. A stack of folded sheets, discovered in an old family chest, watermarked just so. The hand is elegant but not too elegant. The paper has a past. The forger knows that collectors cherish origin stories nearly as much as the objects. A widow's trunk, a lawyer's folio, a parish clerk's pile of papers rescued from a damp cellar. Every story trails the faint perfume of plausibility, which is all a good forgery needs. Vrain-Lucas refines his craft. He writes not in Latin or in the shifting orthographies of the 17th century, but in 19th century French, because that is what he writes best and because, he thinks, the collector will not notice. He forges letters from giants and ghosts, Pascal, Newton, Galileo, and then, as his confidence grows, Cleopatra, Mary Magdalene, Judas Iscariot, Pontius Pilate. The madness is not in the ambition but in the reception. Chasles, dazzled, pays. An anachronism is smoothed with the promise of more context next time. A searing detail lands like a seal. Over the years, Vrain Lucas will sell tens of thousands of pieces, some 27,000 forged letters and documents to French collectors, with Chasles as his most reliable market. Wikipedia. You pause on that number because it strains belief. 27,000 is not a crime of impulse, it is a life. It implies a regime, early rising, steady copying, a repertoire of hands that changes just enough from Augustine to Dante to Pascal. It implies a procurement pipeline for paper, older sheets culled from flyleaves and account books, cut and trimmed, inks mixed to bite the fibers convincingly, watermarks studied and imitated or hidden. Vrain Lucas does his research in the public libraries of Paris, lifting factoids to seed his texts, the way a clever pickpocket uses a crowd to cover the move. Wikipedia. What makes his scheme plausible isn't the ink experts could have tested it more rigorously if they'd wished, but the audience's hunger. This is the Second Empire and then the early Third Republic, an era of pamphlets and proofs, of cabinets of curiosities dressed up as laboratories. Collectors compete, academicians duel with footnotes. Chasles in particular is susceptible because the letters seem to confirm a French claim over an English one, that Pascal whispered gravity to Newton before Newton ever sat under a fabled apple tree. When Vrain Lucas supplies a letter in which Pascal implies French priority, he's not just forging a page, he's forging a patriotic correction to the ledger. Chasles leans in. He takes the case to the Académie des Sciences. Wikipedia. And CTM Publications. You sit with the mathematician at his desk as he arranges the papers for presentation. Perhaps he rehearses the speech he'll give, the phrasing that lets pride wear the mask of scholarship. He is not a fool. He has a brain trained to recognize patterns and reject noise. But expertise has its blind angle. Where Chasles thinks he is weighing handwriting, he is actually weighing desire. Vrain Lucas, meanwhile, becomes a one-man scriptorium. He keeps producing when challenged, and when a scholar points out that Cleopatra could not write in 19th century French on watermarked paper from a later century, the forger supplies a fresh letter from a different authority that explains the anomaly. The tactic is as old as confidence games. If a lie fails, address the failure with 2 lies more. He gives his customer what his customer needs in order to keep believing. Wikipedia. Imagine the forensic work of the day. No ultraviolet lamps, no chromatography. There is chemistry, to be sure, and librarians who know the feel of papers and the ways inks feather. But in the 1860s, authentication is above all an art of reference and reputation. You compare a hand to a sample. You consult a colleague. You trust your eye. You trust the source. Vrain Lucas understands the ecology of trust and cultivates it. He looks gentle, even helpful, certainly not predatory. He frames himself as a middleman with a knack for finding things. Criminals, they say, either jolt systems or swim inside them. He swims. The money is not incidental. Chasles will eventually part with well over 100,000 francs on the strength of these discoveries. A fortune spread across years of improvements to a private archive that turns out to be a theater set. But the money is not the only currency in play. There is the prestige of unveiling in Paris, documents that overturn an English myth. There is priority, a word that tastes metallic in scientific circles because it decides who gets their name carved where. There is story, and story rules the bloodstream of the 19th century mind. Wikipedia. Now picture the moment when the story meets a harder surface. In 1867, Chasles brings the documents to the Academy, eager to show that the lines of the universe bend ever so slightly toward France. The room in the Institut is polished, the audience elite, and the letters are passed along the bench like relics. but certain men have handled the real handwriting of Pascal and Newton. They look, they frown, they compare known samples, a murmur. The hand isn't right, the ductus, the habit of joining letters, the slant. There are anachronisms that no amount of patriotic zeal can paste over. If the letters of Cleopatra are in French, then either Cleopatra is a time traveler or someone else is. Chasles pushes back, and Vrain Lucas defends with more paper. The unease only deepens. Wikipedia and CTM publications. Step outside the chamber for air. The quay is busy, the bookstalls open. You try to set aside the embarrassment that flares when intelligent men are duped. But there is something to learn beneath the blush. Great deceptions aren't built of bold strokes. They are woven from fine threads that match the weave of the world around them. Vrain Lucas isn't inventing a new appetite. He is feeding an old one, the learned craving for documents that settle old scores. Even the British response to the rumored Pascal priority will soon bridle at the thought, not merely because it wounds national pride, but because it restages a long, weary argument about how science remembers itself. The letters jab the softest tissue, identity. Futility closet. Meanwhile, the autograph market swells with whispers. Dealers nod knowingly. Of course, caches turn up. Paris is layered like a millefeuille with papers left behind by revolutions, exiles, sales. Librarians roll their eyes. They have seen too much to be surprised. But the Academy's scrutiny matters. It puts a different light on the desk where Chasles keeps his treasures and on the hallway where Vrain Lucas waits, hat in hand, with yet another envelope. There is also the quieter labor, the investigative work that doesn't reach newspapers but grinds forward in offices after hours. Curators begin building internal dossiers, copies of the Pascal to Newton letters, notes on watermarks, comparisons of letter forms with authenticated samples. They do not yet have the soft X-rays and microscopes of a century hence, but they have patience. They gather small contradictions the way a detective gathers habits. A signature that plants itself a millimeter too high, a flourish that belongs to a different education, a fold that should be older than it seems. When the dam breaks, it will break all at once. Vrain Lucas is arrested in 1869, and when the Paris Correctional Tribunal hands down its judgment in February 1870, it reads like a cautionary paragraph written for every future archive. 2 years in prison, a 500-franc fine, and costs an efficient sentence for a remarkably inefficient century of credulity. Chasles is left to account for his purchases and his pride, the Academy for its wavering, the learned city for its appetite. But that reckoning belongs to later. For now, the house of paper is still standing, trembling. Maths history. Project Gutenberg. What does it feel like to hold one of the forged letters before the fall? The sheet is warm from the hand. A certain rightness travels up the fingers. The ink sits comfortably on the fibers as though it grew there. You read the words with the certainty of being addressed. That is what a good forgery sells, not the object, but the sensation that the past is speaking directly to you. The forger gives you a seat nearer the stage than you deserve. It would be easy to mock Chasles, but the more instructive exercise is to follow his investigative missteps. He let affirmation bias steer his hand. When he found what he wanted, he stopped looking for what might hurt. He let provenance by anecdote replace provenance by record. A moving story is not a chain of custody. He mistook quantity for corroboration. That there were many letters proved only that someone had time. And he trusted reputation, his own more than the awkwardness in his gut, that rose when a sentence sounded a touch too modern. As for Vrain Lucas, the scholar in you might be tempted to ask whether he loved the materials he abused. He clearly loved paper, its weight and waver, and hands their muscles turned into strokes. He loved reading enough to pillage it for telling crumbs. But he loved power more, the power to tilt history with a pen. In that sense, he is not a paradox at all. He is a reader who decided that marginalia weren't enough and rewrote the text. You step back into the Academy room as the last of the letters is returned across polished wood. It's a small human scene men with spectacles, a table, a clerk, but the stakes are large. The prestige of a nation's science, the self-respect of its learned societies, the integrity of its archives. The whisper gathers. This hand cannot be Pascal's. Chasles tightens his jaw. He will not surrender the dream lightly. He will bring more letters to explain these. And Vrain Lucas, for now, will keep bringing him the paper that buys him one more week. Wikipedia. The silence after a meeting like that is different from ordinary quiet. It is a corridor silence, thick with what was not said. You, listening across time, can hear how close Paris stands to an embarrassment and how stubbornly pride holds the door. The forgery has reached the point where it must either collapse or be shored up with still more invention. And here is where we leave you, at the threshold of the unmasking, with a mathematician clutching letters that confirm his national story, and a forger ready to supply whatever the story requires, and an academy poised between credulity and rigor. What happens when the tests chemical, comparative, moral finally press in? What does a city do when what it most wants to be true becomes the one thing it cannot afford to believe? The crack begins, as it so often does, in a detail. Someone notices that a Pascal letter is written in French phrasing that did not exist until a century later. Someone else remarks that the paper is watermarked by a 19th century mill. A scholar familiar with Newton's handwriting holds up the forged sample beside an authentic one and cannot reconcile the strokes. These are not dramatic revelations, but the slow work of patience accumulated anomalies, whispered in hallways and scribbled in margins. Chasles, meanwhile, doubles down. In his lectures and reports to the Académie des Sciences, he defends the letters. He insists the collection proves that Newton's discovery of universal gravitation was inspired by Pascal, thereby granting France intellectual primacy. The room is divided. Some defer to Chasles' reputation as a mathematician of stature. Others squint harder at the paper. The debate spills into pamphlets and journals, with voices on both sides sharpening their pens. When pressed, Vrain Lucas is agile. He produces supplementary letters, freshly inked, that clarify inconsistencies. A critic questions Pascal's syntax. Here comes a note from a translator explaining why. A scholar doubts Cleopatra's French. Out arrives a papyrus-styled apology conveniently preserved. The tactic is familiar. Overwhelm doubt with more narrative, bury the fault line under a flood. For a time, it works. Chasles himself buys more documents even after misgivings are voiced. But the Academy cannot indefinitely ignore the absurdities. The idea that Mary Magdalene wrote to Lazarus in fluent French, or that Socrates signed his name in Latin script, strains even Parisian credulity. More damning, the sheer volume, tens of thousands of rare letters, defies plausibility. How could so many treasures have escaped every archive until now? The affair becomes a scandal by 1867-1868. The Academy publicly rejects the authenticity of the Pascal Newton letters after closer inspection and refuses to endorse Chasles' claims. Newspapers carry the story. The learned world begins to laugh not just at Chasles, but at France for being eager to prove what flattered her most. The police are called in. Investigators trace the trail of documents back to their supposed source. Stories about widows and provincial chests dissolve under scrutiny. All roads lead to Denis Vrain Lucas, who by now has been living comfortably off the proceeds of his pen for nearly a decade. He cannot conceal the boxes of forged papers in his possession. There are too many. When questioned, he insists they are authentic, but the net has closed. In 1869, he is arrested, and the trial that follows is a spectacle. In court, the absurdity of the forgeries is laid bare. Thousands of letters from Alexander the Great to Judas Iscariot are revealed, all written in the same anachronistic French hand. Experts testify. The press delights in recounting the more preposterous examples. Chasles, humiliated, admits he was deceived but clings to the hope that not all the letters were false. The tribunal, unsparing, delivers its judgment in February 1870. 2 years imprisonment for Vrain Lucas, a fine of 500 francs, additional costs for the trial. It is a light sentence compared to the magnitude of the fraud, but the real punishment is social. Chassels's reputation suffers an irreparable blow. The Academy distances itself. Foreign journals sneer. French scholarship, for a season, finds itself tarred by the embarrassment of having let patriotic desire cloud critical judgment. And yet, in a strange twist, the documents themselves, though forgeries, become curiosities of value. Collectors will later prize them not for their false histories, but for their place in the annals of deception, the way a counterfeit coin can outlive the mint that cast it. Where we stand now, the forgery is exposed, the forger imprisoned, the mathematician disgraced. But the deeper question lingers: why was Paris so ready to believe? When Denis Vrain Lucas sat in his cell after the verdict, the obvious question must have pressed on him. How did this ever succeed for so long? To us, looking back, the letters are comically transparent. Mary Magdalene writing in French, Cleopatra praising Christianity before it existed, Newton scribbling in a dialect untouched by 17th-century syntax. And yet the deception endured almost a decade, and its most prestigious victim, Mitchell Chassels, was no fool. He was a respected mathematician, celebrated for his work on geometry and the theory of functions. How could he fall for something so crude? The power of expectation. Part of the answer lies in expectation bias. Chassels was a man eager to demonstrate France's intellectual primacy, to prove that the seeds of Newton's genius had been sown by Pascal. Each letter fed that narrative. When a document aligns perfectly with what one wishes to be true, scrutiny softens. You read not to test, but to confirm. This is the same impulse that fuels investment scams, pseudoscience, or political disinformation. We are sharp skeptics of what challenges us, and gentle hosts to what flatters us. National pride and scholarly rivalry. The mid-19th century was a period of intense nationalist scholarship. Britain and France jostled not only on battlefields but also in libraries. Who invented what first? Who led in science, in art, in letters? A letter suggesting that Newton borrowed from Pascal was more than a curiosity. It was a blow struck for France. In such an atmosphere, critical faculties can be clouded by patriotic desire. The authority of supply. There was also the authority of the supplier. Vrain Lucas did not style himself a rogue dealer. He presented himself as a loyal researcher, a man with connections to provincial archives and sympathetic widows. He spun a plausible backstory: forgotten trunks, neglected heirs, provincial neglect. To a Parisian academic, such tales fit neatly into stereotypes about the countryside. Why question them when Paris so often rescued the ignored treasures of the provinces? The seduction of volume. Then came the volume. Not one or two manuscripts, but thousands, 40,000 in total by some estimates. The sheer abundance created its own credibility. Surely, if a man were faking, he would not dare invent Cleopatra, Newton, Socrates, and Judas all at once. Paradoxically, the implausible scale dulled suspicion, because each new item lent weight to the others. A market hungry for paper. The 19th century was also a time of document mania. Libraries, collectors, and universities were desperate for manuscripts to cement prestige. Authenticity standards were not yet codified as they are today. Paleography and forensic ink analysis were in their infancy. Collectors relied heavily on expert opinion, which itself could be biased or corrupted by vanity. Into this hunger, Vrain Lucas poured his endless supply. Chassels's tragedy. The deepest tragedy belongs not to the forger but to Chassels himself. He was not motivated by greed, but by patriotism and curiosity. He spent an immense personal fortune, nearly 150,000 francs, on the manuscripts. When unmasked, he bore the humiliation not only of being deceived, but of having his own reputation reduced to a cautionary tale. His legitimate mathematical contributions remain, but they are forever footnoted by the scandal of the letters. The legacy of a forger. As for Vrain Lucas, His 2 years in prison did not erase his name. He left behind an archive of forgeries that, ironically, gained their own form of immortality. Some survive in collections, studied not for their content but as examples of confidence artistry. He remains one of the most prolific literary forgers in history. The story lingers because it is not merely about one man's fraud, but about a culture's vulnerability. It reminds us that forgery succeeds not by genius alone, but by exploiting what we most wish to believe. And so, as the doors of the courtroom closed on Denis Vrain-Lucas in 1870, the larger verdict hung in the air. A nation eager for glory had been made complicit in its own deception.